Okay, so picking up where we left off, I want to say last Friday. It's been a little while, but if you remember, we were kind of going back in time to essentially look at how the process that got us to yesterday evening sort of began um, almost 18 months ago, right? And so we left off talking a little bit on the National Party Convention. This was something that many of you probably saw, either because you were watching it directly or just sort of noticing in the periphery. These conventions happened over the summer, and it's where kind of the primary season um, wrapped up and all of the primary votes were counted, and the delegates cast their vote then at the National Party Convention for who was going to be their party nominee, right? And so this happened over the summer. Joe Biden was officially declared the nominee of the Democratic Party. Donald Trump was the nominee of the Republican Party. But the significance of the National Party Convention is more than just nominating the president and vice president, even though that's very important. It's also where kind of the next 4 years of the political party is sort of planned. So the party platform is, think about it like a platform for a fort or a house, right? You build on top of a platform, you lay it all out. And so the planks of the platform are basically where the party planks are. You picked what you believe on certain issues, right? So um, for the Democratic Party, it would be comprehensive immigration reform. It would be, expanding healthcare access. Um, and so moving on here, continuing forward, if I can get this, we said this is where the delegates meet to cast a vote, but we need to do a quick little bit of history here, right? Because this is focused on in Chapter 9, and the history of how we got into 2020 is a big one, right? And so really from the early 19th century, 1830, all the way up until Richard Nixon, these delegates for the national parties were essentially the kingmakers, right? These delegates were incredibly influential people in the party. They were party elites, but they were generally important people who had either bought their seats through political donations, but they chose really the president, right? And so, you know, throughout the primary process from 1830 to 1968, candidates would compete for, state votes, but at the end of the day, it was still these delegates that crowned the party nominee at the convention. Um, Now, this changed in 1968, around the time that a lot of things in government changed in 1968. And if we looked at kind of the history of why did the American public lose so much faith in government in the late 1960s, it tracks directly with the Richard Nixon Watergate scandal that many of you saw in APUS history last year, as well as Vietnam, right? And so these two historical context pieces explained why Americans sort of fundamentally just started to look at the political process and say, this is pretty gross, right? Like, here's these backroom delegates picking who's going to be the nominee um, based off of political gifts and political favors, and they're not really doing what the people want. It's super undemocratic, and so following these Vietnam era protests and all of the grossness that was the Watergate scandal with Nixon being found with briefcases full of cash. There was a commission put together within government that was aimed to sort of fix the revolt that was happening across America, where people suddenly realized that they'd been lied to and fooled for a lot of years. And so the McGovern-Fraser Commission was this commission charged with um, cleaning things up, right? And so they reformed the nominating process and they put the nominating process directly in the hands of the voters, right? And so, Colorado's primary process, voters would cast their ballot for who they want for nominee, and then this would happen, right? And so from this point on, delegates were no longer these kingmakers, these party elites given all this power. They were actually just elected by Democratic Party members or Republican Party members. And so, actually, last year, um, we actually investigated as an AP government class how perhaps we could have students running for party delegates of one of the two major parties. Because as long as you're a member of the party, you can run to be a convention delegate, and meaning you would go and you would attend the convention and you would cast your ballot for um, the party nominee, right? And so from this point on, and this is something that I want to clarify here. Um, this is a historical exception for a long time, and I left it in this lecture, even though it's changed because I think it's a good thing to talk about. But for a long time, there was something called superdelegates, right? Which um, was essentially these party elites that were kind of like the old school party elites that were not required to cast their votes at the convention based off of what a state said. Um, Instead, they could vote for whoever they wanted, right? And so these were oftentimes, governors of states, mayors of important cities, major fundraisers, or political strategists. These were people within both of the Republican and Democratic Party that the party basically said, you guys can vote for whoever you want. And these superdelegates were not beholden to the people of the states. This changed in 2016, so these numbers are now old. Um, but in 2016, after the controversy of Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, and Bernie Sanders voters very much feeling like they got robbed, and that the nomination was stolen from Bernie Sanders, um, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party had already done it, but the Democratic Party basically agreed to clean up the superdelegate, and they said, this was the same sort of thing that grossed people out um, about the state delegates prior to McGovern and Frazier, and so we're going to clean it up here. And so in 2016, the Democratic Party voted to dramatically lower the number of superdelegates, and not only lower them, excuse me, but make it so that they could not vote on the first ballot at the convention. And so the first ballot at the convention, um, basically when all the states are doing this roll call and they say, "Hey, okay, Colorado delegates, who do you cast your vote for?" And Colorado stands up and says, we cast our 22 delegates to um, Bernie Sanders. And then we say, okay, and delegates from New Mexico, who do you cast your ballots for? And they say, we cast our ballots for Joe Biden. That's the first ballot. um, but if after that first roll call of all 50 states, not any one of the major party candidates um, gets enough votes to become the nominee, then basically they say, okay, everyone, take an hour break and we're going to go back and we're going to do a second vote. And on the second vote, from that point on, all of the state delegates are unbound, meaning they can then vote for whoever they actually want to, not who their state required them to. Now, this hasn't happened for a while, but that is essentially how a convention works. It is a hard thing to tell the story over a Zoom lecture, um, but hopefully you got it, right? Like, if you watched it this summer, you saw the roll call where they went through state by state and say, okay, Colorado, okay, California, okay, Washington, okay, Oregon. Who do you cast your um, state delegate votes for? Um, but if after that first ballot, not enough votes are gotten by any one candidate, then on the next ballot, every single delegate is considered unbound and they can vote for whoever they want to, not necessarily who their state required them to. This super delegate thing, I'm not going to actually do this quote because it's no longer really relevant. So now let's actually go back and say, okay, so that's generally how this happens. Let's start at the beginning of the timeline and say what is a candidate's first step towards getting the nomination? Where does it all begin? Where did Joe Biden begin? Years ago, where did Donald Trump begin before he really got involved? What are a candidate? excuse me, what are a candidate's first steps towards pursuing the nomination? And so the first step is something called an invisible primary. And this is a really informal part of this whole process because informal primary or the invisible primary it sort of happens before the whole election gets going, right? It's time. So if in 2020, the election happened in 2020, the invisible primary would have happened somewhere in late 2017, early 2018 when candidates who were kind of thinking about maybe getting involved in the race started to kind of like turn over some rocks to see, do they have enough support? Can they put together a team that they think, makes them viable? And so this is called the invisible primary season. This is a time way before any votes are cast when basically candidates who are thinking about running begin to kind of touch base with major fundraisers or campaign managers or strategists or people they might want to recruit to be their press secretaries or social media consultants. They start basically kicking the tires, reaching out to people and saying, "Hey, if I run for president, what do you think? Would you join me? Would you support me?" And so it's meeting with a lot of bigwigs, right? And so if you're a Democrat, maybe that means touching base with some really powerful Democratic pollsters and Democratic fundraisers and Democratic donors and saying, "Hey, if I run, will you guys support me?" Um, and so this is kind of that invisible time that happens. It's not really like, hey, it begins here and ends here. It's basically a behind the scenes thing where candidates start to see like, yeah, maybe this isn't going to be my year, right? Like maybe I should just sit this one out. Doesn't seem like a lot of people are going to support me. I'm not going to have, an easy time raising money. Maybe I just don't do it this year. Or you kick the tires on it and you say, okay, people really want me to run. Seems like I'd have a lot of support. Somebody already volunteered. This person, my number one pick, said they would be my campaign manager. Yeah, this is going to go good. And so this time of the invisible primary, it's where you're kind of touching base with people. You're maybe picking up some endorsements of important people who say, um, "Yeah, I will support you." And this is a time where candidates who are thinking about running start to just like realize like, are they a serious candidate or are they just going to be wasting everyone's time? This is also a time when building image is most important. So, if you're a US Senator engaged in this invisible primary trying to decide whether to run for president, this is where you might sponsor a couple bills to get your face out there. This is where you might, start doing some media events or, going on Sunday morning talk shows. This is a time where you want to get your face out so people start to be thinking about you, start to be talking about you, start to recognize you um, in order to kind of see, are you going to be viable if you do run for president? And so a lot of people participate in this invisible primary season. Like a lot of candidates look at this and say, um, I tried, it doesn't seem like it's going to work for me, I dropped out. But some, make it all the way through. And we saw in 2020 that, the Democratic primary system started with like shoot, I if I was still back in Atlas, we could just look up at the wall at all the pictures taped to it. But it was something like 18 different people who then eventually ran for president. Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, Beto O'Rourke, et cetera, et cetera. But even more than that, in the invisible primary season, if 18 people actually ran for president, it's entirely reasonable to say 35 people probably thought about it and sniffed at it and tried to see whether it was going to be um, a good idea. And so we're going to pick, no, we're going to keep going. I guess we have 40 seconds. So now let's talk about the next step, right? So the invisible primary season is wrapping up. Um, Here's the candidates that think they have a chance, that there's something viable there, that people will support them. They put together a staff. They've started to realize they could raise some money. So, okay, now what? How does the formal nominating process begin? And so, really, the first formal time for the nominating process to begin um, is the Iowa caucus. It is the very first step in the primary season in the nomination process. It's the first meeting where party members get to gather and decide who they want to represent them.